Good evening and welcome to Foucault 1213. Le gouvernement de soi et des autres is the title Foucault gave to the 10 two-hour-long seminars he taught from January to March 1983. The first 2 hours on January 5th constitute almost and I hesitate to say this, but an intellectual testament of his work, although it was not intended to be so. In more depth than ever before, in my opinion, he described his work as a series of displacements in his search for what he calls the foyer d'expérience, that Graham Burchell translates as focal points of experience. I may be wrong about this, but I believe this is the first time he uses this expression. Maybe the kind of philological attention Foucault devotes to concepts like Ausgang, exhomologesis, or paresia should be devoted to his own expressions, especially when the concepts he invents, like foyer d'expérience, are so powerfully charged from a semantic and from an affective perspective. This is not my mission here, of course, but in this case, the spatial, intimate, even homely character in some of the meanings of the noun foyer are in a certain way challenged by a concept of experience that is, at its turn, charged with the idea of risk and danger explored by Georges Bataille and definitely by Foucault himself in his search for the construction of the subject responsible for the veridiction. As he poses it, his project has been, and I have the French text, but I'm going to read the English. His project was replacing the history of knowledge with the historical analysis of forms of veridiction, replacing the history of domination with the historical analysis of procedures of governmentality, and replacing the theory of the subject or the history of subjectivity with the historical analysis of the pragmatics of self and the forms it has taken are the different approaches by which I have tried to define to some degree the possibility of the history of what could be called experiences. The experience of madness, the experience of disease, the experience of criminality, and the experience of sexuality are, I think, important focal points of experiences, foyer d'expérience, in our culture. This then is the route I have tried to follow, and that quite frankly it was necessary to try to reconstruct for you, if only to take a bearing on where we are. Mais vous le saviez déjà, he finishes this sentence, but you knew this already. After establishing the terms of his project, he moves on to commend two Kantian texts in order to put them as an inscription, as an emblem of what he intends to do, also a very Kantian movement in itself. These two texts are Was ist Aufklärung of 1784 and the text on revolution that Kant included as part of his reflections on the philosophy of history. The question he wants to highlight is the central Kantian question. What is this modern present time? Foucault considers that the Kantian project is here an ontology of modernity. Also, for the first time, I believe, Foucault explains his intellectual lineage, a philosophical form that goes from Hegel to the Frankfurt School, including Nietzsche and Weber. They founded a form of reflection, he says, to which I feel attached as much as I can. It is in page 67 of the French edition that Foucault states his project. It has been a painstaking process. He has been willing to be purposefully slow. He wanted to measure his steps. Je vais piétiner. This piétinement, this shuffling, is necessary, he says, to understand not only what is paresia, the central concept in his research of the government of the self and the other, but also what is not. If, following Kant, those who are cowards cannot even think of leaving the state of intellectual subjection they live in, paresia instead is an act of bravery, a courage, also a risk, a danger that opens up in front of the veridictional subject. This is what he wants to study, pages 69-70 of the English translation. As a starting point, this last paragraph of page 69, as a starting point, I would like to take the way we see this notion of paresia taking shape. How can we locate in antiquity the formation of a particular dramatics of discourse in the political domain, that of the counselor? How did we pass from a paresia, which characterizes the public orator, to a conception of paresia, which characterizes the dramatics of the prince's counselor, speaking and telling him what he must do? These are the first two figures that I would like to study. Second, I would like to study the figure of what I will call simply, somewhat schematically, the dramatics of the minister, that new dramatics of true discourse in the political order which appeared around the 16th century, when the art of governing began to acquire its eminence and autonomy and to define its own technique in terms of the nature of the state. What is this true discourse addressed to the monarch by his minister in the name of something called raison d'état and in terms of a particular form of knowledge, that is to say, knowledge of the state? Third, we could see the appearance of a third figure of the dramatics of true discourse in the political domain, which is the figure of, let's say, critique. What is the critical discourse in the political domain that we see forming, developing, or anyway assuming a certain status in the 18th century and on through the 19th and 20th centuries? And finally, of course, we would locate a fourth major figure in the dramatics of true discourse in the political domain, which is the figure of the revolutionary. What is this person who arises within society and says, I am telling the truth, and I am telling the truth in the name of the revolution that I am going to make and that we will make together? This series of seminars not only continue the lines of inquiry of the two previous ones, but also lead to this unexpected end, that is, the courage of truth, the last seminar that he taught until a few days before his death. To explore the stakes of this seminar, we need to have wonderful guests. In the first place, we will invite Judith Revel, ancienne élève de mon ancienne École Normale Supérieure de Fontenay-Saint-Cloud. She is professor of philosophy at the Université de Paris-Ouest Nanterre-La Défense, where she is also a member of the Sophia Paul Laboratory, Sociologie, Philosophie et Socio-Anthropologie Politique, and director of this research project Discipline et l'Archive, in collaboration with the LabEx program Les Passés dans le Présent. Judith Revel is the author of Foucault, Expérience de la pensée, Dictionnaire Foucault, Foucault, une pensée du discontinu, Dictionnaire politique à l'usage des gouvernés, and Foucault avec Merleau-Ponty, Ontologie politique, Présentisme et Histoire. Yeah. After that, we will listen to John Rachman, adjunct professor and director of modern art MA programs in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. He's also taught at Princeton University, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Collège International de Philosophie in Paris, and the Cooper Union, among others. Among his books, we can mention Michel Foucault, The Freedom of Philosophy, Le savoir-faire avec l'inconscient, Éthique et psychanalyse, Philosophical Events, Essays of the 80s, Constructions, De Deleuze Corrections, and Rendre la Terre légère, among others. Sharon Marcus, our very own Dean of the Humanities, and Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She has also taught at University of California, Berkeley. She is the editor of public books and author of key works like Apartment Stories, City and Home in 19th Century Paris and London, and Between Women, Friendship, Desire, and Marriage in Victorian English. Will present also a text on Foucault. And after that, like always, Bernard Harcourt will pose some critical questions, and I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming our wonderful guests. Judy.
So thank you for this invitation. Since we are to talk little and discuss a lot, which I will try to do in my very broken English, even if this presentation has been translated, wonderfully translated by Raphael, to whom I'm very grateful. I will go directly to the points that I found especially interesting. There are, I think, two ways of grasping these lectures of 83. The first is to attempt to understand how Foucault develops from the beginning of the 80s onwards a Greco-Roman sequence, which he jokingly called his Greco-Roman trip, and how within this sequence during the last 2 years of lectures between 83 and 84, Foucault uses and develops the notion of, how do you say Parisia in English, Paresia, in a surprising way, in what we might call a sequence within the sequence. The recent publication in France of the conferences Foucault gave at Berkeley in the fall of 83, published as Discours et Vérité last year, make it possible to understand how Foucault constructed the movement of this sequence, which we could roughly schematize as not only the fascinating study of the notion of paresia in itself, but the movement from political paresia to philosophical paresia, and finally within the latter philosophical type, the subdivision between the paresia of Socrates and the paresia of the Cynics. I won't address this sequence directly in itself. I will attempt rather to approach it from two possible entry points, which the 83 lectures seem to suggest in a quite surprising manner. A surprising but also strangely off-flying manner, as if from the margins of the main discourse. I will explain without further ado these two possible entry points, which are for me two leads to pistes de recherche quite important. So first, on the one hand, we have this strange first lesson on January 5th, 83, in which at least two themes emerge like Russian dolls, one inside the other. And these two themes form a double excursus in relation to the announced subject of the lecture, namely the reprisal of the theme of paresia, which had already surfaced on several occasions during the 82 lectures. These two themes are digressions in relation to the study of practices of erudition that Foucault wanted to conduct, and to which the figure of paresia, among others, seems to belong. And there are also digressions as insofar as they mobilize a completely different historical periodization, since they deliberately depart from antiquity. These digressions are as follows. The analysis of the theme of actuality, that is to say also implicitly and in a broader sense, the analysis of the way of relating to history that is inscribed in philosophical thought. And the reference here, of course, is the famous section in which Foucault comments on Kant's Das ist Aufklärung, but also an intriguing footnote on pages 5 and 6 in the French edition proposed by Frédéric Gros, because in this footnote, Gros reproduces a passage of the manuscript that was not read aloud during the lectures, and which concerns a series of methodological difficulties that Foucault must confront if he wants to build his own project of a history of systems of thought. That is to say, also a history of modes of erudition, or a history of the division, le partage of the true and the false at the very heart of the philosophical enterprise. The second possible entry point, now, it seems to me that in the 83 lectures, we are confronted with a progressive intensification of a theme, almost in a musical sense, the theme of practices. And this, in fact, generates a double substitution, that of logos by ergon, or that of philosophy as discourse of truth, discours de vérité, but that of philosophy as test of truth, épreuve de vérité. this theme leads Foucault from within his very reflection on paresia, not only to measure and analyze the paresia as one specific practice in relation to other possible practices, but to make of paresia in the practice of philosophy. Further, Foucault is led to define philosophy as a practice and philosophical life as testimony, témoignage, as manifestation of the truth. So there is an important shift here that we could summarize as follows. The series Discourse, Truth, Philosophy as a search of adequacy to truth must be slowly substituted by the series Practice or Practices, Truth, Philosophy as manifestation of truth, which is completely different. From this perspective, I think Foucault's commentary on Plato's Letter 7 on February 16th, and then on March 9th, the idea of the philosophical life are absolutely significant. Indeed, the idea of the philosophical life emerges, it would seem, once the political character of paresia is reinvested in the paresiastic practice of philosophy itself. And as a result of this, the site, the space of the political also changes. Let us then return to the two digressions that I pointed out a moment ago, that is to say the January 5th lecture. The beginning of the analysis of the Kantian text corresponds in a very classical way to what Foucault usually does, and that he had already done in 1978 in Qu'est-ce que la critique? The text is historically contextualized, and the analysis of the historical contextualization gives rise to specific stakes, in particular to the inscription of the present, of the question what is happening today, as Foucault puts it. But I think everything changes very fast. In the last pages of the January 5th lecture, you said it, another text of Kant is quoted, encased, as it were, within Foucault's commentary on Kant's 1784 text, is a reference to the contest of the faculties. This second reference serves, I believe, to introduce the tipping of a theme, of the theme of the present into a second theme, the theme of actuality. That is to say, the passage from the idea that we are able to recognize the present historical determinations which make us what we are, to the idea which consists to affirm the possibility of constructing discontinuity in relation to that very present. This passage from present to actuality relies on two different things. On the one hand, it's linked not to a historical analysis, but to something as an experimentation, to a practice, to something akin to a test, une épreuve. On the other hand, it immediately engages the question of subjects. This possible tipping from one into the other, this questioning of the present state of affairs that can lead to the interruption of these very affairs, does not only affect our knowledge, it includes immediately the question of the subject form itself. In its collective, that is to say, also political variant. Oui. And at this point, the reference to the contest of the faculties that Foucault introduces explicitly as, I quote, a continuation of the 1784 text, takes on its full meaning. The reference is called upon by Foucault to take charge of both the idea of the possibility of discontinuity and its political stakes. And it does so essentially using one word, fleetingly introduced and perfectly new to Foucault's thought, the word revolution. Indeed, Foucault cites Kant, and I'm quoting Foucault quoting Kant, which is a strange exercise, so it's Kant. no matter whether the revolution of a gifted people, which we have seen carried out in our time, succeeds or fails, no matter whether it piles up misery and atrocity to the point that a sensible man who could hope to see it through successfully at the second attempt would nonetheless decide never to make the experiment at this price, end of quote. And in a reworking of an extract of the same lesson for the Magazine Littéraire, Foucault adds, such a phenomenon in the history of humanity cannot be forgotten because it has revealed a disposition within human nature, a faculty to progress such that no politics, no matter how subtle, could have extracted from the prior course of events. The revolution, in any case, will always risk falling back into the former rut, but as an event, the content of which is unimportant, its existence attests to a permanent virtuality that cannot be forgotten. End of quote. So the second dissertation of the Contest of the Faculties is made to comply with what Foucault himself is attempting to say. It matters little whether the revolution is successful or not. The revolution is not a historical fact. It is neither a date nor a conjunction of circumstances. The revolution is an always present virtuality, a bifurcation that can be witnessed at every moment, the permanent possibility of discontinuity from the very meshes of the history. It represents precisely the uncoupling of present and actuality that Foucault is trying to grasp. This torsion, which is a powerful philosophical gesture, is no doubt from a Kantian perspective a forcing of the text. But it is entirely oriented towards the construction on the basis of the uncoupling of historical continuity, present, and the discontinuity of the event, the revolution as actuality, the construction of a reopening of history towards the future, on the edge of a today that is open to that which is not yet. Discontinuity appears then both as a rupture and as an overcoming, an interruption and a process of constitution. It is precisely a test, une épreuve, and I insist on this word, épreuve, because it appears again in the February 16th lecture of 83 before being reprised the following year in the study of the Parisia of the science. This test, cette épreuve, is indeed at the heart of what Foucault defines on the basis of his reading of Plato's letter 7 as the real of philosophy, le réel de la philosophie. I quote Foucault, "The reality, the test by which and through which philosophical veridiction will demonstrate itself as real, se démontrera soi-même comme réel, is the fact that it addresses itself, can address itself, and has the courage to address itself to whoever it is who exercises power." End of quote. From Kant to Plato and back, this test, épreuve, is not simply the refusal of the present state of affairs. It never implies that one can get out of history, that one can ignore the weight of determination, nor that one can act as if we were not products of these historical determinations. This test, épreuve, is always also both a confrontation of what is and a constitution, a production of the new, something which is new. This production of the new is deeply rooted in some practices that appear as its liminal condition of possibility, the relation to self, the work on the self by the self, the renewed elaboration of the self, in which, of course, self can never be reduced to an individualistic reading, but immediately determines the social forms of the relation to others. We can see it at the end, for example, of the February 16th lecture. Philosophy, no longer understood as logos but as ergon, is defined insofar as it is a test as, I quote Foucault, an articulation of the problem of the government of self and the government of others, end of quote. Because time is short, I will be much quicker concerning the second digression, that is to say the manuscript footnote of January 5th lecture. In this footnote, Foucault deals with a methodological question that seems removed from the question of parrhesia and from the Kantian excursus, namely the recurrent reproach that he could risk falling into relativism, or using Foucault's word, negativism with a nihilistic tendency, historicizing negativism, nominalism, and so on, and so on. But the reproach is based on the idea that the historicization consists in moving an object through history, truth, madness, the self, and so on, in order to understand how each different period gave a different version of the same object. In this sense, relativism, says Foucault, means the history of the different ways in which different periods thought the same object. Foucault's gesture is totally different. Foucault wants to give an account not of effects of variation of the same object, but of effects of emergence of the objects. Emergence, once again, is the possibility of discontinuity at the heart of the present, the figure of actuality that Foucault develops out of Kant, or the possibility that philosophy might define itself as ergon on the basis of a figure of parrhesia whose political character, once again, is not only reaffirmed but reinforced as soon as it is placed within the practice of philosophy. All this is possible only because truth-telling, le dire vrai, or if you like, critique, la critique, is always a double gesture, a stripping of what exists and the inauguration of something else. At the end of the March 9th lecture, Foucault says, I'm quoting the text, it's not for philosophy to say what should be done in politics. It has to exist in a permanent and restive exteriority with regard to politics, end of quote. It would be a mistake, I think, to infer from this that parrhesia, as philosophical parrhesia, must, once it has forsaken politics, be apolitical or impolitical. Philosophy escapes the impolitical just as it escapes relativism, because it constitutes a sort of inauguratory transformation, and that it makes possible new emergences. This theme of the other life, which is already well developed in 83 and that will return at the end of the 84 lectures. And in particular, I quote Foucault again, philosophy as constitution of the subject by itself, end of quote. That is to say, as a political and ethical experimentation of new forms of the relation of the self. From a methodological point of view, the new is that which allows Foucault's historical analysis to escape relativism. From a philosophical point of view, the new is that which allows parrhesia as a political gesture paradoxically situated in this outside of politics, which is philosophy, to be both critical and constituting, which seems to me to be exactly that to which the idea of a manifestation of truth corresponds. One last point to finish and to conclude. It is clear that the lectures of 83 are not the lectures of 84. Within the lectures of 83, the analysis of political parrhesia and the dimension of the logos are still hugely important. It's true that the theme of the practice of truth and the theme of the philosophical life are only sketched on the side of antiquity in 83, whereas the theme of historical discontinuity and the theme of actuality as emergence are far more developed on the side of Kantian modernity. We are at a pivotal moment in Foucault thought, a thought which still needs time to develop. And yet, everything is already there. Philosophy emancipated from logos becomes mode of life. The critique of illusion becomes a principle of transformation and of constitution. The site of politics, the space of politics, the definition of politics is displaced from advice to the prince or technical skill to a certain practice of truth, not only truth-telling, dire vrai, but also a truth-acting, agir vrai, and a truth-living, vivre vrai, which will be the one of the cynics. And at the crossroads of all of it, we find that which was already announced as central in Foucault's initial commentary on Kant on January 5th, I quote for the last time, what is really at issue is always this question of the subject, of the political subject. What concerns philosophy is not politics. It's not even justice and injustice in the city, but justice and injustice inasmuch as they are committed by someone who is an acting subject. Philosophy's question is not the question of politics. It is the question of the subject in politics. It's March 2nd, 83. And I close here.
Thank you very much, Judith. John?
So I'm very happy to be able to take part in these lectures. I've written a little bit in a blog how much these lectures that have been organized by Jesus and Bernard have opened so many questions, have been conducted in such an open and rigorous manner. So I wanted in my spoken remarks to try to isolate a little bit some of the questions that interested me in the lectures as a whole and in this course, relationship to them. I agree with Jesus. I think maybe Judith can also comment on this. I think foyer d'expérience is introduced for the first time in this, so that's a kind of very interesting detail or part of those opening statements where he's describing what he wants to do. And I agree also with Judith that there's something very interesting in these lectures about how these foyers d'expérience, how they fit with this larger problem of the history and politics of truth, have something to do with politics, have something to do with a kind of philosophy that doesn't tell people what to do and yet is still political. The external to politics, very complicated phrase in the quotes that you gave for me. So it's those maybe two sides of the remarks that led to my reflections. So just for this summary of the problem I was trying to develop a little bit in this blog. So first, it seems that reading these lectures, we see a constant preoccupation on the part of Foucault with the problem of truth, the problem of saying the truth, the problem of the constitution of forms of knowledge that they can be true or false, and so forth. And so there's many practices that he looks at and many very interesting kinds of analysis. Among them in this lecture and in the follow-on, Parisia or Parisia. Parisia strikes me as a very different kind of very different instance of dire vrai than l'aveu, the avowal. Of course, Foucault analyzes how avowal figures in law very early on, and of course in these lectures that he gave in Louvain. And you see that avowal, as it figures in law, is part of a larger history in which we see practices of avowal in other domains. So you can imagine a new kind of history of law focused on juridical forms, the role of avowal in it, which at the same time would be found in other practices. You have a new kind of history of law. I think it was an important preoccupation of Foucault, and one that is very interestingly developed in the courses themselves, and of course in the discussions we've had about it. Foucault found these practices in many. First of all, I think there's many practices. There's not a single one. The problem of critique or critical philosophy, or his recasting of his critical philosophy, is how to do the history of all of these many forms, and what the consequences, what the critical consequences, what the consequences would be for an intellectual activity which itself would be political. What would it mean to examine these things? It's a little bit my sense of this. As far as Parésia is concerned, and maybe Jesus and people who are better philologists than me can comment on this, but it's very interesting, even in Foucault's own reconstruction, that not too many people translate Parésia as dire vrai. It's in fact translated as speaking frankly, speaking freely, even freedom of speech. The strongest way, and philologically speaking, in which before Foucault the idea of Parésia was presented was as a matter of freedom of some kind, or free speaking of some kind. So Foucault, in effect, is classifying it as an act of dire vrai. I think it's a first remark. Even in the Judith talks about the translation of these Berkeley lectures. So in France they have a very good title, but in English, Silver translated them as fearless speech. So you don't even have the word truth at all in a first general mark. And second, that because Foucault takes this word Parésia and he looks at it in many different circumstances over this enormous long period that leads from antiquity to the beginning of Christianity. And you see that it figures in different circumstances. You can advise a king, then you have a problem of flattery, or you can speak up in an assembly, and so forth. So there's different ways in which this activity, Parésia, which Foucault is saying is an activity of dire vrai, figures it. So those different, the two things I've mentioned so far, advising kings and speaking in assemblies, of course, are very strong sites, to use the word that to which Judy drew attention, of politics. You can advise Alexander the Great, you can teach Alexander the Great, or you can stand up in an assembly that's constituted by equal people and have your words said. So within this larger range of sites in which dire vrai figures, it seems to me that the most original, the most interesting are the cynics. And in the history of philosophy, I think it's very rare for somebody to give such an importance to the role of the cynics themselves. And in this way, to see the cynics as part of a philosophical history that has very distinguished people like Plato and Aristotle and so on and so on. So one remark about the cynics themselves, I think one of the things that Foucault likes in cynicism, it's a form of philosophy that has no doctrine, that refuses to have a doctrine. and is not telling you what to do, like as in Foucault's quote. It's of course you have this problem of the scandalous life to which Judith was referring, but cynical acts are ones that are a philosophical activity in some sense of that term, but which refuse, which challenge, without providing a larger epistemology, a doctrine, a metaphysics in which to understand those acts. And just a few words about that aspect. And again, I defer to people that know more about the philological problem about cynicism. But as a consequence, since the cynics left no doctrine, and in fact invented a philosophy, the purpose of which was to leave no doctrine, what we know about them is reconstructed after the fact. Essentially, what you have are anecdotes that tell the story of these acts, of these cynical acts, written many years later, so you don't know whether they're true or not, how much they're reconstructed, and so on and so on. That's the kind of status of the literature on cynics. And maybe a few more things about why this focus on cynicism, which is pursued in the next course, is interesting. The first is that the cynics are the first philosophers to use the expression cosmopolites, cosmopolitan. We're not citizens of a city-state. We're external to politics in that sense. We're citizens of the cosmos, the world. We're citizens of a different kind of sense. It's a very interesting term, cosmopolites, of which, of course, is a long history and a lecture by Kant and so forth. And second, I think this is true, that it's the first philosophical school to have women. There were women cynics. The second interesting fact about cynicism. And finally, next in the next seminar, Foucault says, well, maybe there's some posterities of this cynical parousia. And it's a very interesting excursion, digression a little bit of the kind that Judith was pointing to. Also one where you feel like, since he realizes that this is his last seminar, that he wants to suggest a little bit where things could go. And so, where is cynical parousia to be found later in the modern period? Anarchism, Dadaism or art, and already in Baudelaire, and connected to this, the idea of nihilism, where nihilism is not God doesn't exist, everything is permitted, but nothing is true. Therefore, what should we do? Passages from that thing. So it's very interesting. The role of art and artists in all of this is a side of it that interests me. And in the series of lectures that in which Foucault again comments was ist Aufklärung, and then isolates this problem of the moment, the moment, and then imagines a reconstruction of the role of critique in Europe, where you have the German school and the French school and the American school, ending with him or Canguilhem or somebody. Among those, and he includes an interesting discussion on Baudelaire himself, on Peinte de la vie moderne, and so forth. So it's very interesting, that side of things. Maybe, for example, Pussy Riot could be seen as an activity of cynical parousia and so forth. So it's not in science, it's not in political science, where you see cynical the posterity of cynical parousia in modernity. It's in those forms. Okay, so some remarks about the first part of this course that concerns Kant. And what he calls a fetish text of Wassersaufklärung that he's coming back to, but he's adding the commentary of these passages about revolution in a subsequent essay called The Conflict of the Faculties. And of course the dates are important because the conflict of the faculties are given after the French Revolution. So that's sort of the circumstances. Their earlier one was before the French Revolution. So in effect, if in the first essay, Wassersaufklärung, Kant is asking something about the present moment, he then is confronted by this enormous thing that happens in Europe called the French Revolution. And so in the second, in the conflict of the faculties, he's asking, well, then what's revolution, if that's what an event is? To reconstruct a little bit the sequence. Those that portion of this course, as Judith was saying, was published already in the Magazine Littéraire and then in English. So it's part already of the published works so in this circumstances, what interested me is why in 1980 did Foucault come back to this fetish text and add this extra problem of revolution as it figures in the essay The Conflict of the Faculties. Just a minor aside on The Conflict of the Faculties, a very interesting essay in its own right, of which one can read an elaborate commentary by Jacques Derrida. That says nothing about revolution, but is focused on the problem of responsibility, this kind of Levinasian idea of responsibility, which turns out to be a lecture he read at Columbia about the university at Columbia. So just an aside on the nature of this, the side of this that has to do with the faculties themselves, because it's faculties in the university, so there's higher faculties and lower faculties. So I'm leaving out a little bit that aspect, except to say this, that in the period in which Foucault was giving these courses in France, we see other people writing about Kant, and in this essay in particular. And apart from Derrida, there's Lyotard. And Lyotard published a book called Le Différent, I think 1981 or something like that, so it's rather close to these dates, that ends with an elaborate commentary on the same passages, what's enthusiasm for revolution and so on, but also developed in a rather different way. We have in Foucault a series of readings of this text, Wassersaufklärung, and this edition. If you look at them all as a series, you see that they all start in 1978. And that's a little bit the source of my interest in them, rereading them now. Among them is an essay given by Foucault in 1978, to which Judith referred, called What is Critique? A lecture that was given at the Philosophy Society in France, which is interesting in the series because it contains a phrase, what is enlightenment? It means we don't want to be governed like this anymore. One of the formulations of this problem, different from the other essays, but very much connected, it seems to me, to this problem, government and self and others, and to what we've, sorry, I'm taking a long time, encountered surrounding the theme of governmentality itself. as in the passages quoted by Jesus, he's not analyzing power. He's analyzing forms of government, the way we govern ourselves and one another. And in particular, we see earlier on, instead of having state and society be the organizing principle of our political thought, we should have forms of governmentality and their relationship to something called biopower, which introduces a new and administrative kind of political formation. There's that a statement that connects early on these lectures up. So sorry, I just wanted to say, and this is maybe the source of my hypothesis that I tried to develop a little bit in this blog. If we look back to 1978, and it's true in this lecture, Foucault says, I've left something in suspense. I've just talked a good deal about ethics, but I've left a problem in suspense back in 1978, which now, through this commentary of the theme of revolution in Kant, and this analysis of parousia as a truth-speaking that has a political function, I'm going to develop, I'm going to come back to. Of course, some people see the late Foucault as a turn to ethics, but in these last two lectures, the real focus, the main focus is politics. Makes it an interesting part of this. So, why, apart from coming back to this theme, what is critique, was interesting about the situation in 1978. And our discussion of that struck me, and what's it called, Security, Territory, Population seminar, struck me the discussion of these counter-conducts in that, struck me as rather interesting. So just to say very fast, if we look in the lecture on Kant at Foucault's focus on this, we don't want to be governed like this anymore. I think, unlike Kant, he's saying, because Kant, he's saying, in religious circumstances, we want a free use of reason. We want to say, we don't want to be governed by religious authority. But it's that moment of refusal, and it's the idea that a religious authority is a form of governmentality that makes Foucault's own analysis and what he says about it in this lecture, what is critique, interesting. So, so we see that there's that the basic principle is a principle of, I'm going to use the word refusal for the moment. I agree with Judith. It's not. It's a refusal that works within institutions and so forth. The term I like for this in 1978 is the term voluntary inservitude. Very striking neologism of Foucault, and which had to do with a debate about La Boétie, who had written this great treatise on voluntary servitude, about which there was a debate. The four, lots of people were reacting to this thing. But Foucault extracts from this idea that the center of politics is voluntary inservitude. It's, we don't want to be governed like this anymore. It's a first part of this interpretation. And it occurs in very many and complicated ways in Foucault's writing, including some remarks he made about the revolution in Iran, much disliked, and he sort of responds to this saying, I'm isolating revolt from revolution. I'm saying that there's a moment of refusal that's prior to social transformation, to the models of revolution that we're accustomed to, and I want to isolate this So that's a first and political remark. So that has to do with governing ourselves and one another, but also refusing the forms through which, the inherited forms through which we govern ourselves and one another. And the second side of this, which has to do more with truth maybe than politics, surrounds a term that was introduced by Paul Venn called historical nominalism. Paul Venn, who was a historian and longtime friend of Foucault, wrote a book, How Foucault Revolutionizes History. I'm not sure Foucault would have liked the word revolution, but he liked the word, the idea of this historical nominalism. So essentially, and the place in 1978 where this problem of historical nominalism is interestingly worked out is in a debate with these social historians that was given in 1978 but published after in a book called L'Impossible Prison. And it's that debate which develops, I think, this problem of historical nominalism. So essentially, one way of thinking of historical nominalism, as it figures in this debate for the social historians, is that Foucault, it's a group of distinguished historians who, in effect, were challenging Foucault. You've written Surveiller et Punir, but it's had very bad effects. It's depoliticizing effects. It's made it so people think there's nothing can be done. It's like the nihilism, those kind of questions that they were asking Foucault. And Foucault makes a very interesting response to these historians, which consists in saying, you guys are trying to do something else. You're trying to do social history. What I'm trying to do is to explain the terms through which historians rely when they try to make explanations and predictions in the first place. I'm involved in a kind of history that neither explains nor predicts, but rather examines the conditions under which historians, and in particular social historians who believe in social transformation, work. So the very idea of society, for example, as it occurs in the state-society distinction, I'm going to tell you that you can't use that to explain things once you see how that notion of society is itself constituted. And so you see this kind of history, the purpose of which is to dispute those things that we take for granted when we make explanations of any kind or predictions of any kind. So the problem that Foucault was asking is, what's the political function of that? It's easy if there is a program of transformation to imagine that history and politics are related. But if I'm doing this historical nominalism, I'm saying that the things that you use to explain are just the things that need to be explained in this other kind of history. What's the function of that? What is the intellectual function of a critical examination only of our assumptions? And Etienne Balibar is not wrong, I think, in suggesting that this led to a kind of impasse for Foucault. He wasn't sure how to answer that question. So it's that, in some sense, that I see him taking up, and these questions left suspended about and one way of one other connection with this historical nominalism, I think you see after 1978, first Foucault abandons this central focus on modern Europe. As Judith was saying, he went on a Greco-Roman trip. He got out. And yet, through this, he's sometimes coming back, but from a different angle, from a different point of view. So it's very interesting, that's just a parenthesis. in his analyses, and both in the security population book and the following book on the birth of biopower, the idea of Europe itself, how that Europe is a constituted entity of some kind. Of course, you can say he repeats things others have said about, but he was very interested in how the idea of Europe doesn't explain things. It's something that's explained within this larger administrative story at the same time as he's leaving modern Europe and going back to antiquity. A remark about that. So, the one other connection is with the word specific and singular. So, if you're the kind of critical historian, and are you an historian or not? Maybe it's at some kind of border between philosophy and history. But the purpose of your activity is to do the history, a critical history of the very terms people take for granted when they try to explain things. The very idea of madness, the very idea of sexuality. How did the very idea of sexuality arise? We know that it was Foucault's idea that it's something very recent. We think it's a universal thing, but it's something that only was produced with certain forms of knowledge in the 19th century, and only then was the problem of sexual identity central, because we know in these experiences, aphrodisia and so forth in early Greek, nobody was worried about being called homosexual. So that's an example. The thing that people in their histories try to examine, sexuality, is itself a constituted thing, a kind of a pattern. So one connection between this activity that interested me, particularly in that small essay called "Is It Useless to Revolt?" Was where he uses the word singular. So you have the principle of historical nominalism, and that's maybe how he develops this theme of discontinuity that Judith was talking about, is that there are moments in which, and sites, to maybe use this word in this lecture, in which our évidence, our ways of thinking, our ways of speaking that we take for granted are suddenly challenged, or suddenly up for grabs. And the moment of l'actuel, in some sense, is such a moment. So you know that Foucault, in 1976, in an interview called Truth and Power, talked about specific and universal intellectuals. This was 2 years, in other words, before 1978. He uses, there's a contrast between Zola and Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, he's a person, Zola, for in this reconstruction of Foucault, he says, j'accuse, so he's from the point of view of a universal justice, looking down at what's happening in this trial of Dreyfus. Oppenheimer is very different. He's not looking up in the skies, he's working to make the bomb. But when he sees the effect of the bomb, he realizes this is a very bad thing, he doesn't like it anymore. And so the universality of Oppenheimer has to do with the fact that life and death is connected to nuclear weapons, not that he's looking up. So you have a specific intellectual and a universal one. So this problem, disputing what we take for granted as universal through this process, is one that's connected to the specific and universal intellectual problem. Okay, so I'm talking much too long, so do I still have a little bit more time?
You had more time 7 minutes ago.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I had many more things to say. Maybe, well, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stop here. Okay, sure.
Thank you very much. We don't have time to.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sharon.
I want to start by thanking Jesus and Bernard for inviting me here, and I also for being very gracious about the fact that I was not able to get my comments done in time to post them. Bernard and Jesus, all of you are hearing them for the first time now, so we should not expect Bernard to address them when he comments after, because I did not really give him an opportunity to. So, as you have heard by now, Foucault's lectures are about parousia, which he calls truth-telling, quote, the obligation and possibility of telling the truth in procedures of government and in the constitution of an individual as subject for himself and for others. That's on page 42. And Foucault is particularly interested in instances where the word is used to mean, quote, telling the truth in conditions such that the fact of telling the truth and the fact of having told it will, may, or must entail costly consequences for those who have told it. That's on page 56. So one might gloss parousia as the risky speaking of truth to power, although Foucault is careful to note the many meanings that the term bears, both within single texts and across different texts written many years apart. And Foucault also begins his lectures, as both Judith and John have noted, by talking about Kant and modernity. He writes that as moderns, we are always posing the question of the present, of present reality. He writes, what is happening today? What is happening now? What is this now in which we all live and which is the site, the point from which I am writing? So I want to take up the challenge within that question because it shaped how I was thinking about the text as I was reading it and then preparing to write and talk about it. So there are many answers to this question. I'm only going to be talking about mine this week. Reading Foucault's lectures today, now, the point from which I am writing is that every day in the news I find another example of what I consider one of the most salient examples we have of speaking truth to power. Victims of rape and sexual harassment speaking out in public, confronting their rapists and harassers. I don't need to remind you, I think, that this is particularly salient right now within university settings, although there's nothing particular about this problem to university settings. I was reading Foucault's lectures with this example already in mind, even before reaching his central extended reading of Ion, where Cruz's discussion, this is a play by Euripides, I'm assuming we all know that, having read the text now, where Cruz's discussion of her rape by Apollo is an important example of both a type of parousia and the limits of parousia. So I'm going to start by talking about why I would see speaking out about rape as a type of parousia, as a risky form of truth-telling. Parousia, Foucault says, is a form of truth-telling that involves risks to the teller. And the risk comes from the power differential between the speaker and the addressee, as when Plato speaks to a tyrant. Rape, even when the rapist has far less social capital than the person raped, is an act that enforces, in the act itself, a difference in power. And those who have spoken and written about the experience of being raped describe it as an experience of losing all sense of self, both during the rape and in its aftermath. Parousia also implies speaking about things that are difficult to speak about. Rape is a highly underreported crime, despite the frequency with which it occurs for a reason. It is difficult to speak about. Most individuals who have been raped, again, describe finding it extremely difficult to speak or to write about it, even in private contexts, certainly in public ones. Individuals often feel able to speak about their experience of rape only within the context of a collective political movement that supports such speech, and that's a point to which I'll return at the end. So this raises an interesting question about parousia, which is whether it must always be as individual as Foucault presents it through most of this text. Now, I myself have been very interested in recent years in returning to the concept of the individual and trying to find ways to think about individuals as something other than simply expressions of capitalist ideology. So I think there's something very important about the individuality of the speech act that Foucault describes, and this is something we could also return to later. So I do not point out the individuality of Parisia as Foucault constructs it as a kind of knee-jerk criticism of it, far from it. But I do also think that we need to think about the contexts that make Parisia possible for some speakers, though Parisia is by definition always difficult. Is Parisia more available to some social actors than to others? And I would say yes. Some speakers enjoy what we might think of as a pre-authorization to speak, even when what they speak about is difficult and risky. Others, depending on who they are or what they are talking about, venture into Parisia already operating under a cloud of delegitimated speech. What better example could we have of delegitimated speech than a mortal woman speaking of her rape by an immortal god in a Greek tragedy, or I'm not sure that Ion is a tragedy, actually, a Greek play. She is supposed to and does feel ashamed about having been. So I read the whole play. I was very interested in Foucault's reading of it. I think Foucault's reading of it is very, very interesting. He got me interested in a play I hadn't read before. So I actually read a couple of translations too, because as you'll see, a lot of what I'm talking about is going to be about translation. So Crusa is supposed to and does often say in the play that she feels shame about having been raped and has therefore hidden the fact of her rape and kept silent about it for years. Apollo, interestingly, also, and Foucault talks about this, feels shame at committing the rape, which is one of the reasons he never appears in the play. The fact that her rapist is a god hedges limits around what Foucault glosses as Crusa's imprecation and recrimination against Apollo. Mortals need to be careful about criticizing the gods. Crusa is explicitly told that in the play. By contrast, it is the privilege of gods to do what they would like with mortals, although that privilege seems to have limits since Apollo feels shame about his deed. In other words, an aggression like rape is normalized when gods interact with mortals, but not perfectly and completely condoned. What I'd like to do now is look closely at how Foucault and his translator, and the French translator of Euripides, whom Foucault cites in the original French lectures, and whom his English translator translates in the edition that we read, if you read the English edition. How do all of these authors discuss Crusa's Parisia, her unspoken speech about her rape, and specifically, how do they talk about how do they translate the moments where she describes being raped? So I'm going to frame this in advance, and then I'm going to walk you through what is going to be a very painstaking, close reading of the translations. The overview is that what we find is a strange blurring of agency that is fairly typical of modern-day rape culture, and it's hard for me to know whether what we're reading in these texts is an effect of modern translators imposing something on the Greek, or a continuity that has been transmitted from the Greeks to us with variations. That's something that I think it would take a much longer time and a linguistic expertise in Greek that I don't have to figure out. But this blurring of agency that is typical of rape culture, if you read the many, many writings that we now have about rape culture, you find this discussed with great rigor, is that this blurring makes it so that it is never clear whether rape has taken place or not. And sometimes this happens because of the use of a vocabulary that oscillates between rape and seduction. Since both these terms are used, rape and seduction, interchangeably by Foucault, by his translator, and by the translations that the translator cites, let me spend a little time discussing the terms rape and seduction before I turn to the texts. So the term rape suggests that a crime in which someone violently imposes their will on a clearly resisting victim or on someone incapable of giving consent. Seduction, in English more so than in French, but in both languages, implies a situation of muted mutuality, in which a more active party seduces a participating party into either increased willingness or a significantly decreased resistance. So in common usage, seduction is opposed to rape. One is a crime, the other not. One implies violence, the other something ranging from flirtation to aggressive persuasion or persistent persuasion, wearing someone down, but not outright force. But if one analyzes the terms more closely, and in their usage in literature, in legal discourse, in culture, one finds, as literary critic Ellen Rooney pointed out in an important article from the 1980s that is still relevant, that rape and seduction partake of the same logic. And that logic is one in which one party can only consent or not consent to the active sexual will of another. What rape and seduction share is a refusal to think of sex as a mutually willed and equally desired encounter. So how does Foucault speak of the moments in Ion where Cruza speaks out about rape? Let's turn to the text. And I think it's important to be patient and painstaking here, so bear with me because I said we're working with many texts here. And I'm going to list them again just so you can keep track. So we have Graham Birchall's English translation of Foucault. In this English translation, Foucault gives his own English translations of the French translation of Euripides that Foucault was using. So I've looked at Foucault's text, well, it's not Foucault's text, the text that the publishers published in French of Foucault, and he is citing, he's not giving the Greek, he's citing a French translation of Foucault, Les Belles Lettres, published in the 1970s. Then we have Foucault's original French when he comments on the play, and we also have in the English translation in the footnotes, Birchall provides a different English translation of Euripides, this English translation, which often departs from his translation of the French. But I understand why it departs from it, because what he's trying to do is tell us what the French Euripides that Foucault is using sounds like. And it's often very different from what this English translation, which is roughly from the same, well, this is originally from the 1950s and then reprinted in the 1970s. So, on page 80, when Foucault first starts discussing the Cruza episode, Birchall translates Foucault, and Foucault says 3 times that Cruza is seduced by Apollo. The 3rd time he writes, and here I think we can see that clear oscillation between seduction and rape that I talked about. She is seduced, taken by Apollo on the slopes of the Acropolis. Even more interesting, it's not on the slopes of the Acropolis, it's in a cave. We read many, many times after about it being a cave, and I think that's important because the slopes are visible. If anybody happens to be around, you could see what's happening on slopes, but you would not see what was happening in a cave. On page 88, Foucault writes, Apollo has done wrong by taking Cruza by force and then abandoning her. In French, it's en prenant Creuse de force. And a few lines down, he refers to Ion learning that Apollo has seduced a girl and abandoned her, a séduit une fille. So here again, we see on the same page Foucault using taking by force in one part of the page for the same event that a few lines later he calls seducing. Foucault writes of Apollo's shame for his bad action and fears of public reproaches. So for this reason, Foucault explains Apollo will not and does not appear to speak of his rape. Foucault writes that the god will remain mute, ambiguous, and ashamed. So in Foucault's first few lectures on Ion, he treats the terms rape and seduction as interchangeable. He glosses Apollo as taking Cruza by force, so he clearly describes in some parts of his text what happens in Ion as a rape, and he also several times uses the term seduce to describe the same action. So the key place where Foucault starts talking about one of Cruza's speeches in which she describes the rape is on the first lecture from January 26, 1983, where she, quote, bursts out with the truth only in shame, humiliation, and anger. So in the text of Euripides' play, I want to just explain. I think this comes through in Foucault's text, but not all in one place. We hear about the rape many times. It's actually the focus of the play. We hear about it from Hermes in the opening speech of the play. We hear about it again when Crusoe describes what happened to her the first time she meets Ion and talks to him, but she describes it as having happened to a friend. We hear about it when Crusoe apostrophizes an absent Apollo. That's her imprecation and recrimination to him, against him. And we hear about it when Crusoe confesses to her tutor her past rape, pregnancy, and her exposure of the child. And finally, towards the play's end, when Crusoe reveals herself to Ion as his mother, she refers to the rape again. In this translation, it's the only place where she doesn't call it a rape, and she tells him there that Apollo is his father. So Foucault cites at length and more than once Crusoe's speech to the absent Apollo, which she makes just before her more explicit confession to her tutor. And here I'm going to give you Burchell's English translation of the French translation of Euripides that Foucault cites, where Crusoe describes what Apollo did to her. And it's this. And this appears on page 121. Gripping my pale wrists, you dragged me, crying out, "Mother," to your bed, deep in a cave, seducer god, and did without shame what Caterus, Aphrodite, Burchell needs to tell us there, wanted. Here's how the 1973 Penguin translation, which Burchell provides in a footnote, describes the same thing. Translates, you gripped my bloodless wrists, dragged me, shrieking for help, into the cave, bore me to the ground, a god without shame or remorse, and had your will for the honor of Aphrodite. So in both instances, the translation presents a fairly violent scene, although the introduction of seducer god in the French version of Euripides that Burchell is translating blurs the line between rape and seduction in a way that the English translation of a god without shame or remorse does not. We see this pattern later in the passage. Burchell's translation of the French Euripides has Crusoe apostrophizing Apollo as cowardly seducer, so that would be the French translation Foucault is using. The Penguin translation doesn't say cowardly seducer, it says vile betrayer. I wanted to see what the French Euripides translation was in French, because who knows what Burchell's decisions are and what Burchell is introducing and what was in that translation. So I consulted that. So here's what I found. It's actually interesting. In the French translation of Euripides that Foucault uses, gripping my pale wrists is étreignant mes poignets blancs. Now, both the Larousse and Petit Robert dictionaries translate étreigner as having a range of meanings: to embrace, to enlace, to take, to seize, to clutch. And when it gives examples of usage, these include both hugging someone in affection and seizing or clutching an adversary in battle. So étreindre is itself a word that confuses or blurs violence and affection. When Crusoe says in the English translation of the French translation from the Greek, "you dragged me," the original French translation uses the word entraîna. Tu m'entraînas. And that's from entraîner, amener de force, to take by force. Drag here seems to be the right translation and to capture the lack of ambiguity in that word. Although that word can also have a more positive sense of being carried away as by a beautiful piece of music. Like when you say something's ravishingly beautiful, but ravish can also mean to seize and to take by force. The phrase that Burchell translates as cowardly seducer is in the French translation of Euripides that Foucault cites, lâche suborneur. And Le Petit Robert defines suborner as to turn away from one's duties, to corrupt, to seduce, the way, in a sense, that the serpent seduced Eve. Cowardly seducer seems to be an accurate translation, and here I think Foucault's own language is aligning with that of the French translation that he was using. So what we have in the French translation, what we might call the original French translation of Euripides, is a spectrum of words, étreindre, entraîner, and suborner, that run the gamut from the positive, unambiguous violence of entraîner, to the blurring of violence and affection in étreindre, to the explicit reference to seduction of suborner. Suborner is not a word that implies force. Now, I don't know Greek, so I don't know what is happening in the original Greek and what kinds of choices are being made. Foucault would, of course, have consulted the original Greek. It seems to me perfectly plausible that all of this blurring of seduction and violence could be in the original Greek text itself as well. I looked at several other English translations. They all tend to use very different words when translating these speeches, displaying a similar variability in the degree of explicit violence, force, and compulsion that they assign to this scene. But it is notable that in the 1973 translation of Hermes' opening speech that Burchell cites in his footnotes, this translation, Hermes refers to Creusa being, quote, raped by Phoebus Apollo. Later, Creusa tells Ion that Apollo lay with the friend, who is in fact herself. Later still, Creusa tells her tutor, Apollo raped me. So we see this same wavering of language in this text. Which is to say, Foucault had choices when it came to deciding how to describe what happens between Apollo and Creusa. One of those choices, clearly available to translators around 1983, was to describe it as rape. Another of those choices, frequently taken by French and to a lesser extent English translators, was to describe it as seduction. Foucault more often than not, uses the language of seduction, as we have already seen, and he returns to it, and it's his return he returns to it on page 121, where you can see he uses the phrase séduiseur la séduite. And I want to just say a little more about how the word séduire in French, because in French it's a word whose connotations run the gamut from pleasing and charming. You can seduce someone by being, in the English sense, seductive, but it also can have a much stronger, more aggressive sense of corruption and of moral, if not physical, assault. So I think that's very important to register, that when Foucault says séduire and seduction, it's not quite as weak and disavowing of violence a word as it sounds like in English. So I wouldn't say that Foucault's repeated use of the word séduire reflects that he views what happens between Creusa and Apollo as not rape. But on page 128, there's a way that he glosses what he's been discussing in this apostrophe that I think does do this. So on page 128, towards the bottom, Foucault moves from the citation. He cites the Euripides in French translation at quite some length, this passage of gripping my pale wrist, the god dragged me. And towards the bottom, after the colon, after it says superimposed, he gives a new paraphrase of what's happening here. And he says, this is the exchange between the seducer god and the young girl who agrees to offer her body and who, she says, offers her pale wrists to the god who summons her. I've just read you the passage in French and English. This is not what Creusa says. Indeed, Foucault has cited not once but twice a French translation that identifies Apollo as grabbing, clutching, embracing, seizing Creusa's wrists and dragging her into a cave. Nowhere does the passage cited of Creusa's speech give her describing herself as offering, tending her wrists to the god or offering her body to him. So those of you who are familiar with the discourse of rape and the ways that rape accusations play out when those raped risk speaking out publicly about their rape will recognize a familiar gambit here, which is to say that the victim of rape willingly offered themselves up. Here we've moved beyond the use of the terminology of seduction, which is very ambiguous. Seduction is forceful persuasion of someone whose resistance breaks down, to seduction as encountering someone who claims to have been forced but was in fact a willing, even active participant. Her wrists were not grabbed, she offered them. And the gratuitousness of all this, to me, is that the entire context of Foucault's discussion is premised on his acknowledgement of the fact of Apollo's wrongdoing, That is why parrhesia is at stake in this episode. I have no way of construing any of this definitively, but I would say what we are encountering here are the limits of Foucault's understanding of rape, which lead him to misconstrue a text he has been citing verbatim in ways that undermine his own argument. Now, I point all this out because I think it's important to underscore the limitations of anyone's readings, and particularly Foucault's, because he is such a politically generative thinker, one of the most important 20th century thinkers we have. I also point it out because I'd rather not talk about it, and it seems that a discussion of parrhesia should not avoid articulating what in this particular context feels like an uncomfortable truth, though certainly not a risky one, since I would imagine that in this academic context we've all agreed at the outset to examine Foucault closely and critically. So I want to sum up what I've just been saying, but open it up into bigger questions. Foucault's text shows us that speaking the truth about having been raped constitutes both an exemplum and a limit case of parrhesia. On the one hand, we have what seems a paradigmatic case of risky speech about truth. The risk is embedded in how it takes Crusa 3 attempts in the play to speak this truth, and in the fact that her speech never meets the full conditions of parrhesia, which is to speak truth to a powerful person or God, because Apollo refuses to show himself, and she just never speaks her truth directly to him. And she's told several times in the play, if you read the play, that to do so would, in fact, be to risk death. I'm also inviting us to think about the limits of parrhesia as the Greeks that Foucault works with in these lectures conceptualize it. I think that's worth doing because I find it an important and promising concept. What happens to the risky speaking out of truth when the topic of that truth is defined at its core as an event that eludes the truth, and the speaker as someone inherently motivated to conceal or warp the truth? And you probably have all heard this before, but Lord Chief Justice Sir Matthew Hale in the 17th century, commenting on the law of rape, very famously, and this is cited to this day, said, quote, "Rape is an accusation easy to be made, hard to be proved, harder to be defended by the party accused, though never so innocent. Thus, constructing rape is something about which we can never know the truth." So rape has long been defined, at least by male lawmakers and commentators on the law, by films such as Rashomon, as something about which no one ever says the truth, and about which the truth can never be established. We see this in the way that the various translators of the relevant lines from Ion slip between the language of rape and something that would be not rape. How to have parrhesia, then, around topics that have been laboriously constructed as things about which it is very difficult or impossible to say anything true. Foucault defines parrhesia as the way in which, by asserting the truth, and in the very act of this assertion, one constitutes oneself as the person who tells the truth, who has told the truth, and who recognizes oneself in and as the person who has told the truth. It's on page 68. I think it's a very important gloss on what parrhesia means. It's like an oath of truth-telling that encompasses many temporalities. Well, I've never read of anyone who has spoken out about being raped experiencing this kind of eddying, intensifying, self-reinforcing effect of truthfulness that Foucault so eloquently describes here. On the contrary. Another set of limits for using parrhesia to think about what it means to speak out about rape would stem, I think, from how parrhesia itself is conceptualized. Foucault writes that the parrhesiast is someone who emphasizes his own freedom as an individual speaking. That's on page 65. It's difficult, even paradoxical, to emphasize one's own freedom as an individual speaking when what one speaks about is having been deprived of freedom, of having one's sense of self annihilated, which is a recurring theme in the writings of both male and female victims of rape. It's also notable that most speaking out about rape has happened in the context of collective movements that make that speech possible and that support it. So we might think about what a collective or collectively supported parrhesia might look like, and how collectives instruct the governors how to govern. And finally, I would like to point to a way that we might reorient the emphasis on speech in the concept of parrhesia, on risky speaking out of truth, and reorient that to thinking not about speech that acts on the governor and on the self-governed, but to another important political act, and that is of listening. If we are to think about how to build on or expand the issues raised by Parisia, I would leave us then with these questions. What conditions beyond individual courage need to be in place for individuals to speak risky truths? More specifically, what role do the collectives that support individuals play in making it possible for them to speak risky truths? And we might think here of the role of the chorus in Ion, but also of more contemporary examples. And finally, if Parisia teaches the art of risky speech, speech that is risky because it is made from a position of lesser or little authority and power, what body of knowledge instructs us in the art of risky listening? By which I mean listening that is risky because it might deprive the listener of authority and immunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sharon. Bernard.
Okay. Thank you, Julie Crevel, Sharon, Marcus, John Rackman, for these three brilliant presentations that take us to the core of these 1983 lectures, the relationship between the study of ancient Parisia and the task of contemporary critical thought. I'm going to start with John Rackman's intervention and then work back. So John challenges us to delineate with greater clarity the political project in these 1983 lectures, despite, of course, Foucault's difficult legacy. That difficult legacy being, in effect, the lack or absence of political or ethical imperatives, by contrast to someone else, like Kant, for instance, who is also at the heart of these conversations, who so forcefully advanced imperatives, categorical imperatives. Now, in his presentation, John underscores the dramatic changes and shifts in the political environment over the course of the entire lecture series at the Collège de France. From 1971 or 72, when the repressive French state was so overwhelmingly present that it could be seen just by opening one's eyes. Remember the opening of the 72 lectures, no introduction, one need only open one's eyes. To the period of these lectures, 1982-83, marked instead by a muted political climate and a deafening silence of intellectuals, a present, he says, marked by depoliticization and desolidarization. It is in the context of these changing political circumstances that Foucault's political project shifts toward the object of Parisia. And this is John's brilliant insight that politics and truth follow similar paths here. John helps us to discern how this new political object, this political praxis, this risky truth-telling or frank speech, comes into existence in the very same way that, as John writes, at a specific time and place, some things, rather than others, become up for grabs as true or false. By whom, for whom, through what practices and consequences. So we need to read these lectures on Parisia as Foucault's answer to the problem of depoliticization of intellectuals. Foucault is offering in these lectures a way forward, one that is all about inservitude and disobedience. The critical philosophy that Foucault has on offer, and which draws on Kant's essay, is to think through the present through the praxis of risky speech that confronts others. Now, the end of the lecture, and this is on page 168 of the English edition, the end of the lecture on February 2nd, 83, on page 168, captures this best, I think. The dominant kinds of responses to the political problems of the present, the dominant kinds of responses offered by democratic theorists at the time, fall into three categories. First, it's the use of checks and balances. Hold on for a second. I'm on 160. I'm on 168 of the French. I'm sorry. Let me get. It's 168. So it's the end of the 2nd of February. It's
They do a paradox.
Okay. So in the English edition, sorry, it's page 184. 184. 184 of the English edition. Sorry. So there are 3 categories of responses that are being offered, really, by democratic theorists at the time. The first is the use of checks and balances as a way to contain power and factionalism. And so this is what Foucault refers to as the distribution of power, the autonomy of each in the exercise of power. All right, in a time like ours, we're so fond of posing the problems of democracy in terms of the distribution of power, autonomy of each in the exercise of power. I would describe that as kind of a checks and balances approach. The second is the passage of Freedom of Information Act type statutes, sunshine laws, open data movements, even État Lab in France today. And that's the most recent iterations of democratic openness and transparency, so what he refers to as transparency and opacity. And the third, of course, is the turn to civil society, right? The turn to civil society is a check on the state, what he calls the relation between civil society and the state. Now, these are not what Foucault proposes, not at all. Foucault cannot be inscribed in the liberal democratic turn that is popular in France at that moment, particularly among French intellectuals like Pierre Rosanvallon, Marcel Gauchet, Pierre Manon, and that Steve Sawyer has been studying so insightfully and actually there's a new book of his on this, edited collection on In Search of the Liberal Moment. And here, too, in this refusal, we can turn back to our discussion from last seminar into the passage in the hermeneutics of the subject on page 209, where Foucault revealed his apparent contempt for some intellectuals, saying, you know, the great converts today are those who no longer believe in revolution. You may recall him saying, we only convert to renunciation of revolution. But here in this passage, Foucault isn't taking any of these approaches, but instead turns to true discourse as a way to resist, as a form of inservitude. And this is the refusal that John Rachman was talking about, or disobedience, or some form of revolt. He instead turns to that, quote, necessary, indispensable, and fragile caesura that true discourse cannot fail to introduce into a democracy which both makes this discourse possible and constantly threatens it. It's in this sense, as he suggests earlier on the page, earlier up on the page, that true discourse and the emergence of true discourse underpins the process of governmentality. And it's here then that Judith Revel reminds us of the radical nature of Foucault's move in these lectures. Philosophy becomes a way of life, Revel tells us. The critique of illusion becomes a principle of transformation and of constitution. And, as Judith says, the site of politics is displaced from advice to the prince to a certain practice of truth, not only a truth-telling, but a truth-acting and a truth-living. Philosophy as truth-living. Of course, no wonder that Foucault would then return to Kant's conflict of the faculties to excavate the possibilities of a critical philosophy as truth-living and as opposed to the faculties of theology, law, or medicine. But the puzzle in all this is, as Judith Revel emphasizes, as John Rachman reminds us, with the recurrent references to Foucault's difficult legacy, the puzzle in all this is precisely that Foucault tells us himself at the end of these lectures on page 354 of the English edition, that it is not for philosophy to say what should be done in politics. It has to exist in a permanent and restive exteriority with regard to politics, and it is in this that it is real. Not to tell us what should be done in politics, that is not the task of modern philosophy, nor is the task to divide the true and the false. This is also on page 34. But rather, he says, to constantly practice its criticism with regard to deception, trickery, and illusion, and it is in this that it plays the dialectical game of its own truth. Page 354, then. I think that philosophy as ascesis, as critique, and as restive exteriority to politics is the mode of being of modern philosophy. It was, at any rate, the mode of being of ancient philosophy. And so to solve the puzzle, to see critical theory practice its criticism of illusions, to see Foucault's ascesis, or to hear his poesia, I returned last night to the Dit et Écrit, those remarkable volumes edited by Daniel Defer and François Ewald. So as you know, we're here in the Foucault 13 seminars, reading for the first time chronologically the 13 years at the lectures at the Collège de France, but we have to recontextualize them and help them breathe life back into these other archives. So that's what I was going to propose in the archive here being the Dit et Écrit. And next session, perhaps, we'll be returning, of course, to volumes 2 and 3 of the History of Sexuality. But for these 82, 83 lectures, I returned to listen a little bit to his frank speech in the multiple different political interventions at the time. Whether it was in the context of Poland, where he had gone, as you will recall, with Bernard Kouchner and Simone Signoret on the 16th convoy of the NGO Médecins du Monde to spend 10 days in Poland, which was under a state of siege in October 1982, just before he would deliver these lectures. And on his return, he would emphasize the silence, that silence of intellectuals, that silence that John mentioned earlier. And so he would say, there is in the present hour no discussion, no debate in France on Poland, on the aid that we are bringing to it and on the financing of its debts. Les Polonais, he says, ont besoin qu'on leur parle, qu'on y aille. They need us to go there and to talk about them. J'y suis allé pour cela. That's why I went, mais aussi au retour, but also on coming back, to talk about Poland to the French. Or to listen to him speak out about sexuality, about homosexuality in the gay journal Gay Pied in October 1982, declaring, I will again come back to what we must fight about. The law and the police should have nothing to do with the sexual lives of individuals. Sexuality, sexual pleasure are not determinative criteria in the order of policing and justice. Or in September 1982 in the newspaper Libération, where he would talk about the irregular arrest in Vincennes of 3 Irish nationalists accused of terrorism in August 1982, where Foucault takes the new Mitterrand government to task. And he ends that interview speaking again against the silence of intellectuals of the escalating situation in Poland, where he says, Europe must fight against terrorism, that is true, but the most dangerous terrorism that Europe has witnessed, we just saw it manifested with the 3 deaths, 100 wounded, thousands arrested in Warsaw, Gdansk, and Lublin, referring to the communist crackdown on the Solidarity movement. Or, closer to home for me, an op-ed printed in Libération in June 1983, a few months after these 1983 lectures, titled You Are Dangerous. There, Foucault takes to task those who rallied against intellectuals for speaking up for an ordinary convict, Roger Nobel-Spies, incarcerated in maximum security for 9 years for the robbery of 800 francs, which he denied, conditionally released by the Mitterrand government, only to be rearrested for committing another crime. Let us pose some simple questions, he says. This is on page 524 of the Dit et Écrit. Let us pose some simple questions, he writes. Où est l'erreur? Where is the error, right? Error and truth. Who has been duped? What are the illusions? Where is the intoxication? Finally, where is the courage, he asks. The courage is in the seriousness with which one poses and poses again and again, the oldest problems, the problem of justice and of punishment. And where are the dangers? He concludes that one. As for you, for a crime today would justify, as for you, quant à vous, pour qui, right? As for you, for whom a crime today would justify yesterday's punishment, you don't reason well. But worse, you are dangerous for us and for yourself, at least if you do not want to find yourselves one day under the thumb of a justice system that has fallen asleep. You are also a historical danger, for justice must always interrogate itself, just as a society can only thrive on the work it does on itself and its institutions. Now, I hear the echo here of Creusa in Euripides' Ion. Creusa, who cries out, "Where shall we go to demand justice when it is the inequity of the powerful that destroys us?" Quoted on page 135 of the text. And so I return, as I do so often in 1972 in reading the 72 lectures, to Foucault's political praxis to understand his critical philosophy, just like I turn to the Groupe d'information sur les prisons to understand the notion of giving voice to a discourse. I turn here too to his interventions, his missions, his paresia, to make sense of this shifting terrain of the political and of truth. And I would then propose that perhaps we could also embrace Sharon Marcus's intervention as part of that, as part of the mission, the paresia, to make sense of this shifting terrain of the political and of truth. So I'll conclude here with the epigraph with which I open the introduction to these courses on the blog. Philosophy thus defined as the free courage of telling the truth so as to make ascendancy over others and conduct them properly even at the risk of death is, I think, the daughter of paresia. In the end, the further Foucault reaches back in ancient philosophy, the further he returns to antiquity, it seems, the closer he gets to contemporary critical thought and political praxis. Thank you.
So wonderful. We have some time for a nice discussion, for ideas, for comments, questions. Jeremy? Ed.
Thanks. Thank you all so much. I wanted to just jump right in to a theme that I thought was running through all four speakers, trying to make sense of this awkward, ambivalent relationship that I think all of you have identified between philosophy as paresia, as a seemingly politically significant, risky role or speech, on the one hand, and politics as such, and the basic insistence that, and you all summed it up slightly differently. John, I very much like the formulation, quote, a kind of philosophy that doesn't tell people what to do, but is still political. Judith quotes this perfect passage. It is not, Foucault on 354, which Bernard also quotes, it is not for philosophy to say what should be done in politics. It has to exist in a permanent rest of exteriority with regard to politics. Then Judith says, it would be a mistake, I think, to infer from this that paresia, as philosophical paresia, must, once it has forsaken politics, be apolitical or impolitical. And then Sharon raising this worry about the individuality and sort of demand for an assertion of freedom that seems to be imminent in paresia, that seems to be at contretemps with collective action and with forms of speaking about unfreedom. What I'm very struck by is, and I think what might illuminate this problematic that you've all identified, is John's call to put these lectures in the context of the precise philosophical moment they are occurring. It is stunning. John referred to Lyotard's Le Différent being published. It was published in 1983. Here are some other works that were published in 1983. Badiou's Theory of the Subject, Rancière's Le Philosophe et ses Pauvres, La Couleberte and Jean-Luc Nancy's The Retreat of the Political, Milner's Le Nom Indistinct, the indistinct names, and at this time, as we know, Jacques-Alain Miller was still right in the heart of the Lacan seminars that Zizek was attending, and a few years later will write on the sublime object of ideology. This school, so that group of thinkers, then going on with Roberto Esposito and Alberto Moraes and others, have recently been identified and increasingly identified as sort of perhaps the dominant left-wing European political thought project today. So the alternative to the Rosa Vallant, the alternative to Sawyer's liberal moment people. Bruno Bostiels at Cornell has recently written a book, The Actuality of Communism, that brings all of these texts precisely together along with Foucault and tries to criticize their attempt to think this awkward relationship between philosophy and politics. And I just wanted to throw on the table ways in which Foucault, these lectures are very much in keeping with the emergence of this school that Bostiels identifies, but then one or two odd differences that may suggest something special or different about Foucault. So I'll stop after this, but very quickly, I would say Bostiels identifies three features of this whole conjuncture, coming right out of 1983. The first feature is ongoing interest in Lefort's distinction between la politique and le politique. The second is a return to Kantianism, and particularly with this idea that you can't derive a political program from a philosophy. And third is the rediscovery of the subject after Althusser, but an attempt to evacuate the subject of both humanism and the dangers of political subjectivity that are encountered in the 20th century. Now, it's very striking about these Foucault lectures with those three parameters as a kind of grid, is I think his understanding of Parrhesia really nicely fits two of them. And there may be some resistance to this, but I do think here we see obviously the Kantianism and the idea of not deriving a political program from philosophy. And second, I understand why Judith is pushing back against the impolitical, which Esposito gives us most clearly. But there is something here in Foucault's search for a philosophico-political subject that doesn't have any of the dangerous baggage of the traditional political subject that I think is very much related to Esposito's Impolitical or Rancière's similar attempts. So there, Foucault seems to be right at the heart of this emerging tradition. But he specifically critiques Lefort on page 184, and specifically in the English translation, and specifically says, I want to have nothing to do with the distinction between le politique and la politique, because what is at stake in Dunasteia, what is at stake in the real power relations in a city and the relation to politeia, the constitution and the law, is politics, la politique. And then again, as Bernard pointed out at the end, he critiques the whole democratic moment discourse that Steve Sawyer is talking about. So I wanted to throw that out there and see if that framing can help, can push the speakers a little bit further to discover to resolve some of our discomfort with the notion of Parrhesia and the relationship between philosophy and politics. Is there something about the fact that he seems to share these two moves, the Kantianism and the kind of apolitical, political subjectivity, but at the same time is very aware of the problematic nature of the Lefortian idealism and the democratic idealism?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Adam?
It's very daunting to engage with this text, I find, as a non-classicist, and then even more daunting to encounter the kind of brilliant philology that Sharon displayed in her shocking revelation of this kind of inconsistency, this dramatic inconsistency at the end in Foucault's rendering of the rape. But I can't help wondering, Sharon, I just would love to hear you explicate this a bit more. how you read what's happening on 128, because set as you do, that's the moment where he transposes the rape into an active exchange in which the girl willingly gives herself to the golden god, which I took to be the kind of nub of where you, as it were, find in Foucault the failure to work his way through rape culture. I would love to hear you spell out how you see, what voice you think Foucault is speaking in at this moment. Because I really am thoroughly out of my depth in this Dumézil-Leon-infused reading of classical texts. But my sense of what's going on in this chapter and this lecture, and it's no more than a dim sense, is that Foucault is working through the way in which certain categories that Dumézil offers could be applied to the characterization, and the very peculiar characterization of Apollo as a god. One of which is that he's sort of on the wrong side of the oracle. He's the god of the lyre, and the lyre is supposed to be how humans speak, and so he's a particularly toxic god to deal with because he usurps the role of the singer that's supposed to be the way that humans speak to the god. And the other thing that he is ambiguous in his sexuality, not straightforwardly heterosexual, actually might be the god of a love of boys, and substitutes for that this closeness to gold. And it's in the context of seeing how gold works through this text, and I take it to be a highly critical reading, that Foucault said one peculiarly, as it were, one weird superimposition that might happen on this theme of the offerings through gold. Another meaning of the offering and exchange is superimposed, and then comes your killer sentence. This is the exchange between the seducer god and the young girl who agrees to offer her body. My sense is this is a critique of Apollonian ideology. This is actually a critique of the god who is the golden god and translates the violence of a rape into an exchange. I mean, it's a classic instance of a commercialized rape culture of which Apollo would be the first instance. And if one goes for, I mean, so that's my question really is this, as it were, Foucault offering this additional critical reading, or is this Foucault slipping back into an undigested inability to really escape that all-pervasive rape culture? It wouldn't seem to me in any way invalidate your broader political points about truth-telling and the specific problem of rape, but I'm not sure it's entirely fair to Foucault on this particular moment, in this particular moment anyway.
Thank you. Rosalind, you wanted to say something about this as well?
I wanted to add to this conversation in a slightly different way. It's the anthropologist in me, so forgive me. But but that the chapter that you referred to, Sharon, and I think it's very important that you draw our attention to the conflations and the illusions that take place in that reading. But the crisis, as it gets narrated, moves from the crisis that afflicts a situation in which no one can make the perpetrator of a deed speak the truth. That it is the question of Parisia is not formulated initially as her articulation of her own experience of violation, but the first demand is that the god speak the truth of his deed, not the truth of her experience. And what happens in that the text moves very quickly to a discussion not of the sexual event at all, but the problem of kinship and the legitimacy of descent. Who is going to recognize this son? Is there going to be the mechanism for essentially the vertical transmission of title and property? And because, I mean, this is one of those cases where the difficulty of translation gets even harder. There's no possibility for her not being raped. She has been given an exchange. She's already, there's not going to be a scene of consent here. There's either she will be exchanged legitimately or she will be exchanged illegitimately. So everything hangs on the legitimacy of genealogical and property rights. And so in the move to the next chapter, what's so interesting is you have the displacement of the logic of kinship and exchange in the human domain, which, this is a very structuralist reading, right? The traffic of women, basically. This is what it is. The traffic of women That is, relationships between men are established, and it's very interesting. He says, where does the task of Parisia fall? It has to, I think it says, it falls to men. They'll exchange women, produce sociality in that way, with the illusion of a gift. She was given in exchange. When we go to the next chapter, it's precisely the vertical relationship with the gods. What is the medium of exchange with gods? It's not women, it's gold. And this is, of course, the violation of the legal system, is that the wrong medium, the woman got used with the gods, and it should have been gold. And, I mean, there's a kind of formalism that sneaks back in here. So I don't think, for me, rape culture isn't a term that can work in this context. And if one was to use what Foucault does in terms of his making visible the stakes, the legal stakes in determining, where the task of Parisia gets assigned, and why, Parisia is left with this horrible predicament, and this the speaking of that terrible double bind at the end, or whatever it is. But you both, Judith and John, you referred to his fetish text. And I couldn't help but feel here that there's this kind of weird ghosting relationship with Derrida's Glas. On one side of that text is Kant and Hegel, and very significantly on the problem of genealogy and the reproductivity that's internal to that. And on the other side is Genet and Our Lady of the Flowers. And you have these kind of so many weird and interesting mirrorings and refusals also of that kind of argument. But in a way, it feels like, I think what you're talking about very deeply too is we've talked about this before, the incapacity to take sexual difference on. So that in this narration of the proper exchange relation that would have been produced and its perversion in the movement to the relation with gods, he ends up reproducing that structure. And I don't know. I'll leave it there. But I think it's important to recognize that what he does in that move is to follow the structuralist argument, so that the question of the sexual becomes the question of kinship, and they appear to be the same thing.
We have a comment from LS2 room.
Not the room, from the wider.
From the LS2 world.
Yeah. A comment from Shai Gortler at the University of Minnesota.
Okay.
Returning more to the political questions that perhaps Jeremy was in part posing, and this question is maybe addressed mainly to Judith Revel. So Judith Revel's wonderful remarks mention that the word revolution was perfectly new to Foucault's thought. At the same time, John Rachman reminded us in passing that the word is not completely new. Indeed, during and following Foucault's 2 visits to Iran in September and November 1978, he dedicated his attention to this word. He specifically mentions the word itself with its importance for French history. He specifically mentions that the word itself, with its importance for French history, helps him to bring the attention of the French public to the Iranian Revolution. More specifically, to the 1983 seminar, Foucault's minor texts on the Iranian Revolution discuss it only as an attempt to change a regime. Rather, not only as an attempt to change a regime, rather he frames the Iranian Revolution in the following manner, and I quote, above all, we have to change ourselves, our way of being, our relationship with others, with things, with eternity, with God, etc. These things must be completely changed, and there will only be a true revolution if this radical change in our experience takes place, end quote. Without such changes, Foucault argued, it would not have been possible to face the machine guns bare-chested, quote. Do you see any connection between Foucault's writing on the Iranian Revolution with its specific acts of changing oneself and the parts of the 1983 seminar where Foucault discusses parousia as a practice of changing oneself?
Dana?
Okay. I was going to say something that maybe is a bit obvious, but it's something that's been striking me through all the texts, but this particular series of lectures really condensed for me, and it sort of relates to, I think, a lot of things people were saying tonight. I was struck by how intensely self-reflexive this particular set of lectures is. We have a series of lectures about philosophizing and speaking by someone who from the very start is absolutely concerned with what it means to philosophize and for him to philosophize, and is absolutely worried about how best to speak. I think some of us said this tonight, we say that it opens with a discussion of Kant. It actually doesn't open with a discussion of Kant, but even when he gets to Kant, a lot of it's about the sociology of communication. He says, what I'm interested in is that Kant wrote in magazines, and there's a kind of concern between the writer and the public. So it's about the sociology, the act of communication. But before he gets to that, the discussion is all about, can I lecture this way? What does it mean to stand up in front of all these people, be this figure in front of a vast public? Should I create something more esoteric by meeting next week at 12:15? Where we have a smaller group that precisely will be academic, which is what he says Kant avoids. So there's this kind of reflection on the notion of the intellectual, how best the intellectual can communicate. And maybe this is because I'm a media scholar, I'm struck by how often notions of media occur throughout the lectures, especially this series. And this is 3 years after Derrida's La Carte Postale, so people are thinking about media of communication. And here we have a text that's about recording devices. Sometimes it's contingent. Turn that down, turn the cassette over. But it's also an awareness of that things are being transmitted as they are, with this little microphone on the table. There's the whole discussion of the message that's left in his mailbox by an auditeur at one point. There's the photocopies that don't show up, which is the reverse of the letter that always arrives in Derrida. And then I was struck by how this kind of self-reflexiveness manifests itself in the text by a series of confusions that I think at times are deliberate. One is the confusion of pronouns, and I think we see that in the passage you read, where he says, the fourth figure I want to discuss after the advisor, the minister, the critic, and the revolutionary. The fourth is the revolutionary. And then he goes, who is the revolutionary? He is the one who says, I do this, I do that. So suddenly it's Foucault saying, I. So is it Foucault speaking? Is it the revolutionary speaking? So confusion of pronouns. Also, and I think one of the passages you read had this, a confusion of temporalities. So it's a text in the 80s about the Greek time, but where constantly those are confused. So he'll say things like, there's a very good one on 288, 289. It isn't, let's see, for a philosophy to put itself to the test of its reality, it is as dispensable now as in Plato's time that it be able to tell the truth in relation to political action. It is important for all political practice to be in a permanent relation with this truth-telling. And is that a historical comment, or is it a comment about the present? On the next page, he'll jump back and forth. Philosophy and politics must exist in a relation, in a co-relation. They must never coincide. This, if you like, is the general theme that we can extract from Plato's text. So at times, going back to, I think it was Judith said that he always is trying to give the historical reconstruction. It's also a reconstruction for the present, in the present. And so, I think there's this intensely self-reflexive dimension to this text.
Okay, so why don't we take a first round of reactions from our guests? Judith.
Right, so two small reactions with my pro-English. The first one about your idea on the basis of Bruno Bostiel's analysis of this dominant left-wing group, Rancière, Badiou, and so on. Because you said three elements: ongoing difference between La Politique and L'Éthique by Lefort, the return of the Kantian thought, and third one, return of the subject against Althusser. I think it doesn't work for Foucault because there is no return to the subject in Foucault. There is a totally different thing, which is subjectivation. And subjectivation is, on the same time, the idea of a devenir sujet, that is a process, and the central idea of history. And if you think about Rancière, Badiou, Jacques-Alain Miller, and so on, there is no history in that song. I mean, there is in Rancière when Rancière writes La Nuit des Prolétaires, which is a strange book because it's half a book of history and archives and half a book of Marxist analysis. But if you take the philosophical books of Rancière of that period, 80s and now, there is no place for history. So the question is for me that the specificity of Foucault is in reaffirming a possibility of history through historicization, and he's the only one who did that thing, and it's important because the decision of historicizing the analysis of philosophy, that is historicizing truth, historicizing the modes of subjectivation, historicizing our relations to power, historicizing the theme of governmentality and so on, oblige him to move from a definition of resistance as the building of a counterpower to a new definition in which politics is more this devenir politique ou devenir sujet in a non-identitarian way. I'm not sure to be very clear on that point. If you think about Derrida, it's exactly the same. I mean, there is no history in Derrida. You have no history at all, de la dermatologie. You have a messianic history in some texts, and you have a strange rediscovering of history in the last books, from the book on Marx on, the beginning of 90s. So late in this kind of period. And the same in Deleuze. You have a devenir as an event, but the event is what interrupts, breaks the time, not history. You don't have any historical dimension. So I think this problem of historicization is fundamental, and it's the first. The second one, and it was the question is about centrality of Iran experience, and you said also the Groupe Information Prison, GIP, at the beginning of the 70s. I think these are the two fundamental experiences Foucault made, and for me, probably these lectures, 83, 84, are only the way in which Foucault attempts to produce concepts à la hauteur de ces expériences, on the same level of these experiences. Because if you think about GIP, the Groupe Information Prison is this strange event in which people succeed to subjectivate themselves, and this subjectivation is a resistance itself. I mean, they don't need counterpower. They need to produce themselves as subjects of their own life. And this is the political point. This is politics, and not the way in which they obtain, I don't know, more TV on the cells, for example. And for Iran, the dimension of fight for liberty is probably more important, is probably the important dimension, not for constructing, once again, a counterpower, but for introducing a discontinuity in that present, which is that of Iranian people in that time. So the problem is, for me, this strange shift introduced by Foucault in these lectures of 83, 84, 83 first and 84 in a more explicit way. You have archaeology, and archaeology is the description of the differences between different epistemic, so between past and past. Then you have the moment of genealogy, and it's the way in which Foucault says, okay, past is past, but you have also the problem of present. And the problem of genealogy is to go back, to return to our present. And you have this problem in the Kantian reference too. But you have a third dimension, and this is what I call the new politics definition. And the third problem is strange because Foucault will call this third dimension in 84 lectures la critique comme attitude, ou la modernité comme attitude, the attitude, which is a strange, well, it's what is an attitude. And Foucault explains in a quite clear mode that the problem is not so much to understand what are our limits, the Kantian critique, and it's more to understand how we can stop to be in the way in which we think, and we act. I quote in an approximative way. So the problem is not only to go back to the present, it is also to reflect on the possibility to break this present and to open this present to a future, an avenir, which doesn't exist and which we have to invent. And the dimension of invention, l'expérimentation, says Foucault, is fundamental. It's not exactly the experience. The experience is a theme in a certain way, which is, for one part, lourde phenomenology, full of phenomenological reminiscences. No? Instead of experimentation, is really the idea that what you do, what you act, you can speak as an act, but it's not only the only way. You can act without speech, and the cynics don't need the logos. They didn't write anything. They didn't say anything. They acted, and that's all. So, and it's the reason why it's not a performative dimension, because performative is the speech as an act, but there are also acts without speech. And Foucault says, if you act, you will, in some cases, not always, of course, open to a dimension which is the experimentation of what is not existing now, but what could maybe, if we want, could exist. And the last point is this strange, not in 83, but in the 1984 lessons, this strange theme of the problem of decision, of political decision. What could be different, la différence possible, in the future, dans l'avenir, not only in the present. And it opens to the revolution as the dimension of reinvention, not of the present, but what could be a different present. I think it's exactly what the prison of the détenu du GIP said. And it's exactly what Iranian people tried to do. And even if they didn't succeed, can't. Even if revolution doesn't succeed to blah, 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 it's this virtuality which is political. I'm sorry for that.
Just a quick. I mean, so I think that's right, and I would just say that I think it would be important to multiply rather than reduce the political interventions to Gyp and Iran. To multiply them to include, l'Académie Tarnier and then Klaus Croissant, death penalty, abortion, etc. Because the Gyp, and in part what I was trying to suggest is the Gyp can be thought of through a lens of discourse, a missing discourse, right, of the condemned, and an archaeology, whereas here and in these interventions that he's making in 82 and 83, the danger with the Gyp and what they didn't want to do was to talk for them, right, and so it fit in a certain theoretical framework. Here he is talking in all of these interventions, whether it's about homosexuality, whether it's about the penal system again, Poland especially. Here he is talking, and that there's a sense in which it's a different theoretical framework, motivated by a different concept of critical theory that involves a speaking, but that the speaking has to be very much related to one's own self, right? Because it can't be a speaking for someone else. But in any event,
it's absolutely true. But probably we didn't mention a word which is central in the, for example, in the post-cynical genealogy you mentioned, and it's exactly that point. It's a new definition of militancy. Because the figure of the militant is a post-cynical figure for Foucault. But that obliges us to redefine what is militancy. And it's the contrary of what Badiou defines at the same moment as the figure du militant from a Maoist point of view.
Thank you. We have briefly 3 minutes, 4 minutes for your reactions, please.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll try to respond to Adam and Raz at the same time. So one point is about Apollo wouldn't be interested in women because he's interested in men. Strikes me as a charmingly anachronistic moment in the text, because that's a pretty ahistorical sense of being gay as some kind of exclusive orientation that would be a distaste for women. It's there in Ion's comment too, but Apollo may not have many children, but he's famously a god of rape. Daphne would be another very famous example. So I think it's important, though, to note that in this text, and I think this is something that's very different about the discussion about rape today than the discussion about rape in the 1980s when Foucault is writing, is rape is not necessarily gendered, and it's not necessarily about sexual difference. It's what gods do to humans. It can be what adult men do to women and young men. But that said, I think it's also the case, Raz, you're right, that this is not, and I wasn't actually saying that this was a text about rape culture, that we should apply the concept of rape culture to Euripides. I was talking about how that was a grid through which the translators were probably operating as they struggled to find terms for what is happening in the Euripides play. One of the terms that comes up in Euripides is bia, which is just a kind of, it can mean both forced into wedlock, but it can also just mean force and violence. And I think it's correct to say that there's no such thing as rape culture in ancient Greece because it was all rape. But I don't think that we can then conclude from that, I mean, yes, what you're saying is there's sanctioned taking of women and there's unsanctioned taking of women. But what is very striking about this play is that it is not simply because Apollo did not get Chrysa's father's permission that it is described as a rape. She calls out for her mother. She never says anything about being taken without the proper ceremony being posed to her father. And there's a sense of her will and a violation of her will. And I think that we should be cautious about how we generalize about a culture for which we have so few texts. The texts that survive are written all by men. But I think Euripides is known as the playwright who had more of a sense of female subjectivity, and that one of the things he's inscribing in this play is that there might be an experience of this that wouldn't simply be follow the correct ceremony for deciding who it is who transfers the woman. Yes, Ian is very much about kinship, but I think that one of the questions of kinship that is at stake here that is an interesting and important one is how do you establish the kinship of a child born through rape? And again, this isn't me imposing this on the text. If you read the text is very much structuring this whole event as something that was a wrong that was done, and that even the God acknowledges was a wrong. I would also say that whatever we may want to say about the text itself, Foucault is writing in 1983, and in 1983, rape culture is very much a discussion. We know it was on his mind because since the 1970s, he'd been caught up in these debates because he was making comments about how to think about the law and sex, and sometimes he posed questions about whether rape should be criminalized or not and the problems of criminalizing rape, and he was got into very big debates, or maybe not debates because it wasn't a direct discussion, but feminists had a lot to say about that. He commented about what they said in interviews. All of this took place before he wrote this text. To the point about what is happening on page 128 and who is speaking and whether this is a reading that Foucault is disproving. Well, if it's a reading that he's disproving, it's a reading that he's invented. Like you were saying, this is the reading that he's contesting. That this point that the young girl agrees to offer her body is exactly that was what I took you to be saying. That this is not his reading, and it's a reading that he is saying is a superimposition on the text would be the Dumasilian reading.
I think I thought he was saying that the Dumasilian approach allows you to unlock ways in which the text elides the violence of rape and substitute for it the suggestion of an exchange.
So, having read the text, I find that ingenious but implausible. And I think you're right that what is going on here is motivated by his attempting to give a Dumasilian reading of what is happening in the text. I think that's a possibility, and that's a really good point. But this notion that the young girl agrees to offer her body and offers her pale wrist, it is Foucault who is introducing that, and there is nothing in the Euripides text in any translation I have seen, including the translation Foucault uses, that would allow me to read that as anything but an unreading or a rewriting of the language he was working with that I find bizarre given what is being discussed and the terms of the rewriting.
Thank you. John, 3 minutes, because we really are out of time.
Okay, so I'll just make fast remarks. First, on the question of revolution, Foucault's attitude towards revolution. I think if we look at the group that Bruno Bostius proposes, we see that it's a group of people who had studied with Louis Althusser, who were influenced by Maoism. So what we essentially see in that group is the impact of a revolution, the Chinese Revolution. They took different positions on it. I would say Badiou rather different than some of the other people in that group. A first observation about revolution. The second is that when Foucault saw the revolution in Iran, he was seeing a revolution of a very different sort than the communist revolution. And part of what made it different, and this is the word that I find very puzzling and interesting in his analysis, is the word political spirituality. The communist revolution, you could like it, you not like it. Maoism, you can like it, you not like it. One thing it's not. One thing it is a secular revolution. It's and in fact, the reactions to the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution often drew on spiritual sources and so forth. So that's a first general remark. Of the texts that you mentioned, of course, I like in some ways the Philosopher and His Poor of Rancière. And it's very interesting. Anyway, that's too much about all of this. But in the English edition, he looks back, Rancière, to the political debates in that period and says rather interesting things about all that. The second remark about revolution is that I think it occurs quite a bit, in fact, in Foucault, if you're interested in this kind of problem. I would mention we haven't cut off the king's head in political theory, which is an absolutely central principle of his political analysis. And if we look back, even at a book like The Order of Things, what is it that divides us to epistemism? The event that occurs in between those things is the French Revolution. So when you read The Order of Things, the passages on the king that come from this analysis, this painting of Velázquez and so forth, I think you see. So I think it's a constant. Judith in her dictionary, or very interested in some writings of Foucault in the 70s, where in Japan he says writing's not subversive. So we have to rethink the role of writing. So that's one final remark about the media environment, the discussion of media in Foucault's analysis of Kant, where he talks about the reader, public and private, and so on. I think this problem of writing, very central part of it, very central part, the idea of writing as a technique du soi and all of this, which would be seen in this larger government, a very interesting and central part of Foucault's argument. So, and I think, we now, of course, live in a period not so much dominated with print, but it's very interesting, one final remark, in Foucault's own lectures, and the kind of story that they tell, reading them all 13 one after another. I think you see at a certain point, maybe 1976, maybe a little bit later, Foucault stops publishing books, essentially. The early experiences with Jeep and so forth is absolutely dominated by this absolutely extraordinary book called Surveiller et Punir, which in effect brings all of that stuff together. So these lectures, which Foucault never intended to be public, you have to remember that now are being made public. The early ones connected to this problem are very much associated with the book as a way of making public, if you see what I mean. The entire last period of Foucault's life, the reason that the courses are so important is that we don't know anymore. He didn't ever take all this incredible research and put it into a form which would be the book form that would be made public. So we have something very creative and very different from the earlier Foucault. Anyway, 2 remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I continue this conversation on the blog if you want. Write and send your comments, and we will meet again for the last time, I can believe it, on April 14th for Le Courage de la Vérité at Casa Hispánica.